Hey, welcome. I want to do a quick little discussion of rigid body versus triggers or the IsKinematic button they have in your colliders and rigid bodies, etc. So first question you have is, I have a game object. The game object's typically by default put on a collider, and then you can add a rigid body component. So the question you have to ask first is, what is my game object for? What am I doing with it? So if it's really just decorative, say it's a cloud or a fog, a particle system, then I don't really care if anything collides with it. I don't want anything to happen. So if it's purely decorative, then all I really want to do is I want to remove the collider. There's no sense in trying to detect collisions if I'm not going to do anything with them. So that's one case. The more useful cases are if it's not decorative, you have a choice between whether it's a moving object or not. If it's not moving, then one of the things you want to do for sure is to make it static. This will greatly speed up the physics engine. It knows it can do some pre-processing. It also knows that really if something collides into this object, there is no physics response. The object is static. It's not going to move. Great for walls and many other type of game objects. So a bulk of your scene in Unity will be static. Now, I might have some things that are static, like blocks, walls, in which case, they will exert forces. But what if it's an object that is static that doesn't exert forces? Why would you want anything like this? Well, the most common case for me in this is an empty game object, in which case, it's not drawing anything. I just want to know when the player collides with this cube, in which case I'll make it a trigger. And in that case, I don't want there to be a rigid body. So if it had a rigid body, you want to go ahead and delete the rigid body. This is also useful for things like doors. If I approach the door and I want the door to automatically open, I can have a trigger. There's a lot of events. You have to write a script basically on trigger enter, on trigger exit, on trigger, you're basically in there. And I can respond to those. And you'll see several tutorials in that regard on that. The other useful thing is for bullets or projectiles. I don't really want there to be a physics response to a bullet in an enemy. I want there to be a game code response. I want to know that a bullet hit the enemy, and maybe I can do a raycast and figure out where, and I will deal damage. Okay. So I want something to happen. I don't necessarily want physics to happen. So that is the when you're going to make it a trigger. Okay. If it is a moving object, then perhaps you want to add a rigid body. The rigid body, how does it know to exert the force? If it's a static and doesn't have a rigid body, well, Unity just takes care of that for you. Basically, it's not moving, so it'll use the rigid body to bounce off of walls, say, okay? But this really turns on the physics engine. So one way to think of it is this is kind of a collision detection, and the rigid body is the collision response, okay? So if the rigid body you have is going to respond to forces, something hits it, it moves, you hit something, it will move, then you're done, okay? This would be great. So if I have a box and I have the player and the player pushes into the box, then the player may bounce back and the box may move, okay? So, or you have a bunch of balls bouncing around, they'll bounce off walls and what have you. Now, I could have a moving object that's a rigid body that doesn't respond to forces. So in this case, it will influence other rigid bodies when it hits them, but it will not use the physics engine's response. So this is typical. What I want to do is I want to make it kinematic. I'll use the IsKinematic. And then, again, you have to check, does it exert forces? If it doesn't, and kind of a moving trigger, if you will, might be some use cases for that, I guess, death traps or something like that, then I'll delete the rigid body. But in general, it's going to exert some forces. In this case, I'll have a rigid body, it won't be static, and it will exert forces. Um, and now here I won't necessarily have it respond to forces. So by selecting IsKinematic, I'm turning off the collision response for this object and saying I'm controlling it. And this is useful for basically a lot of things, but the player controller, if I tell something to move forward, then it's going to do its own physics, right? If I basically say, here's a velocity, here's a position, let the physics engine run, then the physics is responsible for moving it forward. Here you're overriding the physics engine and saying, hey, move forward. So my player, in this case, is going to hit a box, the box will move, my player won't. So the way to think about it is kinematic will disable the default response. So what you want to make sure is that you don't have both the physics engine trying to do something and you're moving it. So you could add a rigid body, not select IsKinematic, and still teleport your object, basically telling it to move forward. So be very careful on that. And then have fun playing with physics and scripts that are triggers, and feel free to put a lot of empty game objects around there so you know what's happening in your game code. Thank you.